So let's do a little bit now with organic compounds. We've looked at inorganic, now let's look at organic compounds. Organic compounds make up a field of chemistry called organic chemistry. And organic chemistry is a huge, huge field to study organic compounds. Now, we've already defined organic compounds as a high percentage of carbon, and there are many, many organic compounds. We're going to refine this definition a little bit because now we're going to say not just carbon, but it must be carbon and hydrogen. So organic molecules now contain carbon and hydrogen, and they also sometimes have other types of non-metals such as nitrogen, oxygen, etc. Organic molecules. And here is a chart that lists some common typical organic compounds, some you may have heard before, such as methane. There, notice it's just C and an H, or butane, again C and an H, and those are common things that are used to burn. Octane, CH18. Notice down here methanol has CH's and O's, or ethanol, again CH's and O's, different types of organic compounds. Now the real question here about organic compounds is why carbon? What makes carbon so special? Well, here's our Lewis diagram for carbon, and remember the dots on the outside of C represent the number of valence electrons, and this is what makes carbon so special. It has 4 valence electrons, so it can form 4 bonds. There are 4 places where something can connect with carbon, and that's what makes it such a great element to bond with. It can form a chain with other carbon atoms or other elements and form different kinds of bonds. And that bonding is what organic chemistry is all about. Well, we're going to use these Lewis diagrams to form what are called structural formulas. So what we can do in organic chemistry is we can start to draw pictures that actually show Lewis diagrams that are a little bit more simplified. What we do in the Lewis diagram is we don't show any lone electron pairs, but what the structural formula allows us to do is show how the atoms are arranged into the molecules. So it gives us a picture of this arrangement. And as these atoms are arranged together, they are going to bond together, and any of the bonding pairs are going to show up as a dash. Now what does that mean? Let's look at an example here, and let's choose one of the simplest types of organic molecules, methane. Now the symbol for methane is CH4. If we're looking at the Lewis diagrams, there's the Lewis diagram for carbon and hydrogen, and what this means for CH4 is we have 4 hydrogen that are going to bond with 1 carbon. Because we have carbon that can take a bond, this hydrogen can actually come over here and bond with that lone electron. And this hydrogen, well, we'll just tilt it a little bit here, and then we're going to take it and we're going to bond it right here. And this third hydrogen, let's give it a turn here, and it's going to bond up here. And of course, last but not least, let's give this one a little bit of a turn, and those hydrogens are going to be able to bond with carbon. So 4 hydrogen bond with carbon. Now the Lewis diagram would look like this. Now these bonding pairs, instead of showing them as dots like this, what we do is we show the bonding pairs as a dash, and in the end, here's our structural formula. Notice we have the 4 hydrogen on the outside, the pairs become these dashes, and our structural formula for methane. Well, let's try another one, and we're going to use carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen this time, and we're going to form methanol, which is CH3OH. Now this bonding is a little bit different because we're going to consider now that there's a split right down the middle here. We're going to split into a CH3 and an OH to form this bond. So CH3 would look like this. 3 H's come around one C, and there's one other spot here that's open and available to bond. And what bonds there is the OH. So we just bring these two together, and in the end, we have the structural formula for methanol. Well, let's start classifying, because these organic compounds can be classified a number of ways. The simplest type of organic compound is what's called a hydrocarbon. And a hydrocarbon, why it's so simple, is it's just carbon and hydrogen. And there are many types of hydrocarbons. Most of these hydrocarbons are what we use as our fuel sources. Things like propane, octane, acetylene, fuel sources that you may be familiar with. And if we were looking at the structural formula, here is propane. Propane has 3 C's and 8 H's, and our structural formula, we form a chain that looks like that. Well, another type are alcohol. Now, alcohol is a very, very broad category, and it doesn't just mean things that we can drink. There are many, many different types of alcohols. What makes something an alcohol in terms of organic chemistry is this OH chain, and that was an example that we did before where we have this OH chain. And ethanol would look like this. Here's the structural formula for ethanol. And notice that this would have the OH at the end on a chain of carbons. Well, what about ethers? And ethers you may be familiar with. You may not have heard that word before. Well, ethers are unique because they have an O in the middle of the carbon chain. And ethers were once used as anesthetic for medical purposes. We don't really use them that much anymore. But if we were looking at the structural formula for an ether, it has this O in the center. So C followed by an O followed by a C. The structural formula for ethers. Now we're not going to be too concerned about the structural formulas. We are going to concern ourselves with these types of organic compounds. But this is not all the organic compounds. There are many, many other different types of potential organic compounds. These are just a few for now. Well, where do we get our organic compounds? Because organic compounds were once originally just defined and originally only thought to be found in nature, things that were once living. But now we actually have the scientific capability to create organic compounds in a laboratory. Well, one of the sources of carbon comes from plants and photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, a plant actually takes in carbon from the air in carbon dioxide, and it uses it to produce things like sugars, carbohydrates, and proteins. And these plants can then get consumed by other living things, and the carbon gets into those organisms. And that's where most of our organic compounds come from. Now, over time, these organic compounds, these plants, may actually become oil and gas deposits. And many of our oil and gas deposits now are a result of old plants and animals that died many thousands or millions of years ago. What we're doing is we are taking them and we are refining them and we are separating them into our fuel sources, different types of fuels. And this is what's done at an oil refinery. This is how we get fuel for our cars or how we get propane. They're all done at a refinery. And once they're separated in the refineries, they can be then used to make more complex molecules, such as plastics, a component that comes from refineries. So we're going to look at some organic compounds, but keep in mind it is a very, very broad topic and something that is looked at in higher level chemistry.